Hello everybody, this is Jacob Lawler from the office, wanting to do a quick introductory video on the California Residential Purchase Agreement, or codenamed RPA, or AKA the offer. Now, this is going to be a quick introductory video because when you actually get into our power curve, full scale training, they actually spend one entire day on this purchase agreement. So this is by no means an all-inclusive training video. My purpose of this video is really doing a quick introductory video to kind of at least introduce you to the verbiage and kind of how this is written, and in my opinion, the most important portions of this. So this will absolutely not be an all-inclusive, everything. So I want to at least just expose you to this. That way, when you get into the power curve training, it's not an, oh my goodness, what the heck is this 10 pages of a legally binding contract. That way it's a little bit of, oh yeah, I remember that. Oh yeah, I remember that. So you'll be miles ahead of the other agents in there. So this is a recording that I'm doing on June 28th, 2020, and car form RPA revised 1218. Now, every couple years they do update this agreement, and sometimes it's a huge update and where they change the whole thing. Other times they just change some wording around. So make sure that whatever contract you're doing as of now matches this, or we just have to look at what those changes are. So a little asterisk in there. But again, this is just an introductory video to give you an idea of what's going on with the purchase agreement in here. Now, first off, this first portion of the offer, the reason why I'm introducing you to this is what the entirety of the quote-unquote transaction will be based upon. This is what sets the tone for how long the escrow is, what timeframes are, and everything like that. So if you have to know this forwards and backwards in order to know really what the transaction is going to be like. So I want to at least introduce you to this so that way we can get some things going. So this whole first portion where it talks about the offer, paragraph 1, is really the summary of the offer in here. So this is an offer from the buyer. Real property to be acquired is, this is the address in the city, in the county, in the zip code, and the assessor parcel number. The purchase price to be offered is blank, whatever dollars it is, and then close of escrow shall occur on either a date written here or more commonly blank days after acceptance, which most commonly is somewhere around 30 to 45 days. But it really just all depends upon what that negotiation goes down, and also if there is a lender involved, how quickly the lender can get it done. This talks about the disclosures and confirmation of brokerages. Again, Power Curve is going to get all into this. I want to bring it down to, again, the most important parts in my personal opinion. Number one, the initial deposit. Of course, days after acceptance, that's important to know, but usually, again, it's going to be 30 to 45 days really set by the lender, as well as how quickly the seller and the buyer come to terms on when they want to close it. Then breaking it down to the initial deposit. Now, an initial deposit is the amount of funds that is actually physically brought into escrow by the buyer within, again, per the contract, 3 business days is the default after acceptance. So these are funds that will be debited from the buyer's account. So make sure if you are representing the buyer, you make them aware that these are actually funds that will be debited from your account. They don't go directly to the seller. It's held in the escrow trust account. Now, the default to the contract is 3 business days after acceptance, but also that it will be by buyer direct deposit. It shall be delivered directly by electronic funds transfer is the default. Or you can check some boxes, personal check, cashier's check, and all that. So the default is, again, electronic funds transfer within 3 business days of acceptance. Now, what's considered a full deposit, I'm doing air quotes, a full deposit is considered 3% of the purchase price. Now, you don't write 3% here. You would calculate it out as a percentage of whatever number you end up putting up here where it talks about dollars. Sorry, I am wonderfully having the spinning wheel there. My apologies for that. Breaking it down, after the initial deposit, the next thing that most commonly comes up is loans. Obviously, if you have an all-cash buyer, you would check this box, but that's not the majority of what we're handling here in the office. The next portion would be loans. First loan is usually what we're dealing with. If you're dealing with a second loan, come talk to me on the right way to structure that. Default in the contract is that it is a conventional loan or conventional financing. If you have anything other than that, you would need to check the boxes. If it's FHA, if it's VA, if it's anything like that. Again, depending upon your situation, it will determine other things in there. So what you would then do is say rate not to exceed. And what you would do is you would want to talk to the lender about what rate they are quoted for. And sometimes it's good to give kind of a little bit of a bump in there because rates are flexible. They literally change on a minute-by-minute basis, but making sure that we don't exceed whatever they're qualified for based upon their monthly payment. And then also very commonly, it's commonly put in here to not pay not pay points to exceed X percent. Usually we'll put like 1% in there, depending again on the buyer's situation. Talk to the lender to ask about their current situation. Some people decide to kind of have a quote unquote template where they write in here additional financing terms where they say buyer to accept best prevailing rate and terms on the loan, kind of as a catch-all, but it's really, really good practice to put in an actual rate here and points not to exceed here. Just that way you kind of protect your buyer with another layer of protection. Now, going to the second page of the RPA, verification of down payment and closing costs. Now, it's really good practice to provide your what we call proof of funds with the offer itself. Now, again, it's about your proof of down payment and closing costs, not just proof of your initial deposit amount. So if they're getting a 20% down loan, you want to at least show that you have that full down payment amount in some sort of an account, whether that's a traditional savings account or a retirement account that they're borrowing from or what have you. It's always good practice to have it in a liquid account that's easily verifiable, easily taken into account. Some people get a little bit nervous if it's in an investment account because then, oh my goodness, what if there's a change in the marketplace and their portfolio drops 20% over their escrow time period and what have you. So it's good to provide the verification with the offer in here. Now, bringing it back up just because I just remembered, when we're talking about the loan here, it's good to keep in mind that whatever amount you're putting in here, let's say your client is doing a 20% down conventional financing, you would actually compute this as 80% because it's talking about the amount of the loan. So if they're putting 20% down as a down payment, it would actually be put in here is that 80% for the loan amount. Same thing with FHA. If you're doing a 3.5% down FHA, this would be 96.5%. Again, just like the initial deposit, same thing. You're putting the exact dollar amount, not the percentage in here. And then it will also then auto calculate when you're doing the offer in the program zip forms. It'll auto calculate the balance of down payment. So you'll put in the purchase price down here, which you actually add here, and it auto puts it down here. Then you put in your initial deposit, which again, full amount is 3%, but again, asking the client what are they comfortable with because it is debited from their account. Then you put in the loan and it auto calculates the rest here. One of the great things about the program. So by default, it's 3 days to provide the verification of down payment and closing costs, but very good practice, and you will be countered if you don't supply it with the offer. Next step, appraisal, contingency, and removal. One of the contingencies, or what I like to call safety valves of the transaction, where your buyer is able to get out of the agreement without risking their initial deposit, is the appraisal contingency. This agreement, by default, is contingent upon a written appraisal by a licensed certified appraiser at no less than the purchase price. And the default is 17 days after acceptance to remove that contingency. If they are going to get the loan almost every single time, and if there's a lender who doesn't require this is going to be a little bit concerning, but when they get a loan on the property, they will be required by the lender to have an appraisal done on the property. Now, an appraisal is a cost associated to the buyer. It will be put on either a credit or a debit card. It's usually somewhere between, $400 to $600, depending upon the size of the house. If it's a really big house, obviously it'll be a little bit more. But 17 days to be able to get the appraisal back and to remove that contingency. So again, this is a protection for the buyer. If the home doesn't appraise, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, for the home that we agree to do, that is one of the contingencies of the sale. So you are protected and you're backstopped by the appraisal contingency. Same thing, loan applications. Same thing with the verification of down payment. Defaults to within 3 days after acceptance to provide a pre-approval letter or a pre-qualified letter. Good practice to attach the letter with the actual offer itself. That way it provides some protection for the seller that makes sure that they are at least have some peace of mind that your buyer has at least been pre-approved for that amount, or else you can write any number on a contract, but if you can't get the loan, it's all funny money till it hits the account, right? Again, another contingency to allow the buyer a little safety valve out of the transaction should they not qualify formally for the loan. The default is 21 days after acceptance to be able to be formally approved, to be formally approved by the lender to be able to remove the loan contingency. Again, you could also say no loan contingency if for some reason you are in a multiple offer situation. Anytime that you're going to remove contingencies with offers, make sure you talk to me first. You do have the ability to shorten these time frames, but again, default to 17 days for the appraisal, 21 days for the loan contingency removal. Taking it down, there's a lot of other stuff that Power Curve is going to get into. The only one that I didn't highlight in here that I will highlight at least in the video is the sale of buyer's property. Now, if you are working with a buyer who has to sell their home in order to buy the next one, that's a whole other training class in terms of how to line that up, and that's a very complicated one to do, especially if it's going to be one of your first. So please make sure that you reach out to me if you're going to get into that sort of a situation. That being said, talking about allocations of costs. This paragraph 7 is a very robust paragraph about who pays for what. They're going to spend a lot of time on here in Power Curve, so I won't go into it too much, but basically this just means who pays for what. There is certain ways of writing this where it's considered, and I'm going to do another air quotes, standard for who is to pay for what. But long story short, once you start doing your templates and doing your first transactions, I will absolutely help give you an idea of what's considered customary. Talking into escrow and title, also same thing. There's certain ways to go about it. I don't want to spend too much time on this video. However, we will be able to kind of help put some things into play. Another thing to protect the buyer, to give them at least alleviate some of their concerns, is we will always recommend that we get them a 1-year home warranty plan, which basically covers the major systems of the house should there be anything that goes wrong with them within the first year of them living there. Now, again, we don't want to say it'll cover everything because it really doesn't. However, we can give you specifics, and different companies will cover different things, but a short way to talk about this is if it is a major system in the house, most of it is covered by this home warranty plan, and I can get you in touch with our home warranty reps to give you full information. But long story short, we want to make sure that the buyers have this home warranty plan so that if something major does happen with one of the appliances or systems that is covered, that at least they have that coverage in there, and all that they would have to pay for all intents and purposes would be a service service charge for somebody to go out there, and it really depends upon the company. As of currently recording this, the companies are generally around $60 to $80 per service charge for somebody to come out and change it. Full disclosure, I have fully utilized my home warranty plans for every home that I've purchased. I actually just recently, in the home that I got last year, just got a whole AC condenser unit changed out for just the service charge of $75 for my plan, and they changed this whole $2,500 thing, so it was worth it for me. Now, items included in and excluded from the sale are in here. Now, very important, especially as a new agent, to note this, is that right up above it says note to buyer and seller. Items listed as included or excluded in the MLS, flyers, or marketing material are not included in the purchase price or excluded from the sale unless it's specified in paragraph 8B or C, which is right here. So let's just say that in the marketing material it says fridge to be included, or washer and dryer to be included, whatever it is. Even if it is put in the marketing material, it specifically states in the contract that it is not included in the purchase price unless you actually write it in the contract. So make sure you check this box if they want the stove. Make sure that you check this box if they want the fridge. Make sure you check this box if you want the washer dryer, and then including all additional items. If there's anything else, like sometimes we'll have the backyard jungle gyms or those types of things. Make sure that you include that in the offer itself. Same thing with items excluded from the sale. If you want to make sure some things are removed, you would specifically address that in here. Closing and possession. This means when the buyer gets keys and gets access to the property. Now, by default, it is 6 p.m. on the date of the close of escrow. So make sure your client knows that by default it is 6 p.m. on the date of the close of escrow. Sometimes you'll hear on a vacant house, hey, congrats, you've closed escrow and it's 10 a.m. and then all of a sudden the buyer's already trying to move their stuff in. Technically, the seller has until 6 p.m. that day to be able to get all of their belongings out. Now, they'll tell you in Power Curve, and I will also address it here, whenever there's a seller-occupied property, it's generally considered, again, air quotes, customary or standard or good common courtesy to give them 3 calendar days after the close of escrow, just to provide them an ease of moving and also prevent problems where your clients are coming in with the keys in the front door and they're still stacking their boxes in the living room. It's good common courtesy to do that, and it's really helpful for the whole ending of the transaction where things can get heated and all that fun stuff. You also do have the ability to let the seller stay in the home for a couple times. So if you can do it up to 30 days with a simple form called SIP, or if you're doing more than 30 days, you have to use it's like a residential lease back after sale form. It's good common practice to include that, especially if you're giving them those 3 days, to make sure that they still keep up their insurance and all of those types of things, is to protect your buyer if you're representing the buyer. But one thing to note is checking with the lender to make sure if they're renting it back for, say, like 2 months or so, some lenders will consider that no longer being a principal residence. They'll actually call it an investment property at that point, and they would not qualify for the same type of a loan. So check with your lender if you're going to be doing something like that. If it's a tenant-occupied property, let me know, and then I'll help kind of clarify this whole thing. But that can be a complicated situation at times. A whole bunch of fun stuff that they're going to go over. Power Curve, paragraph 10, talking about all the disclosures. For the sake of this video, I don't want to go into that too much. One thing I will say, paragraph 11 talks about the condition of the property. A lot of new agents and most buyers aren't aware of this, but according to the contract, every single property is sold in its as-is present physical condition as of the date of acceptance. So clients will oftentimes say, hey, is this property sold as is? technically every home in California that uses the California Association of Realtors CAR RPA forms, yes. However, it is subject to the buyer's investigation rights. So you still have the ability to inspect the home and even to request repairs are made. However, it says that the home is sold as is in its present physical condition. So something to note is every home is technically sold in its as-is condition. This talks about the buyer's investigation, talks about matters affecting the property. This is a very vague term, but it's spelled out in here. So this is just illustrating that the buyer's acceptance of the condition of and any matters affecting the property is a contingency of this agreement as specified in paragraph 14B. 14B is my personal favorite paragraph in here. It is also one of the longest paragraphs. It's an entire page. It's actually the next page. I did an entire video on paragraph 14, so I won't be spending too much time on this during this video, but I will at least give you some summarized points. But definitely is important to watch that video because it is a very, very, very important paragraph. Long story short, it is sold as is, subject to the buyer's investigation rights, and the buyer's investigation rights and acceptance of the condition thereof is a contingency of this agreement. So again, there's really three main contingencies for a buyer. There are multiple, but there's really three main ones. Number one is the buyer's investigation of the property, or commonly referred to as the inspection contingency. The second one is the appraisal contingency. Does the home appraise for the contract price? And the third one is the loan contingency. Within 21 days, does the buyer formally become approved for the loan in here? Going into paragraph 14, again, you can see there's a lot of highlighting because this is my favorite one, but I'll briefly go over this and save you the headache of the entirety for a different video where I went into it in depth. Basically, this goes over time periods, removal of contingencies, and cancellation rights. Pretty big deal, which is why it's a very big paragraph, but also my favorite. Going into just a bullet point summary form. The seller has 17 days to give you all the disclosures and tell you everything they know about the property. Short way to know that. So they have a week to give you everything they know about the home. The buyer has 17 days after acceptance to review all of these reports and disclosures given by them, investigate and inspect everything about the property, and the big loophole / vague term, which is approve all matters affecting the property. Very vague, but very important because that is the big safety valve to back out of the transaction for a buyer, is if things are not up to what their quote-unquote standards or conditions or whatever you want to call it. Within that time specified, which by default is 17 days, that the buyer may request that the seller make repairs with what's called a request for repair. Now, very important is that let's see where it actually says that. By the end of time specified, because it says somewhere in here, hold on a second, that the seller doesn't even have to respond to that. I don't know why I'm blanking because I'm doing a video. I'm a little bit nervous. I apologize for that. Oh, there it is. It's literally the next sentence. Seller has no obligation to agree to or even to respond to the buyer's request. That's a very important part to remember, is that they don't even have to respond to that, because if we go back up to the top, every home in California is sold in its present physical as is condition, but subject to the buyer's investigation rights. So again, every home is sold as is, but it's contingent upon the buyer's ability to inspect. They have 17 days to inspect that property and to request that the seller make repairs, of which the seller has no obligation to agree or to respond. But because of that, the buyer, okay, if they don't, let's just say that the real world case scenario, they do an inspection, they find out there's some things wrong with it, they make a request for repair, the seller says no, okay, at which time they have the ability to cancel this agreement based upon that contingency. Because what it says here is after 17 days after acceptance, otherwise agreed to in writing, to complete all buyer investigations, review all disclosures reports, and from which they get from the seller, aka everything they received up here, and approve all matters affecting the property, and deliver all of those back to the seller. Basically, they sign the copies and say that they approve of it. Okay, so what they can do is they make that request for repair. The seller either agrees or doesn't agree, and at that point, the buyer shall deliver to a seller a removal of this contingency or a cancellation. So they can say, hey, look, you didn't agree to our repairs, so either we're just going to move forward with it, because you have one of three options, basically. You can either accept the condition and move forward, because every home is sold in its present physical as-is condition. You can cancel, and it explicitly states in here that they can cancel, because it says it right here, or you can try to negotiate, right? So you can say, hey, we will cancel if you don't agree to at least something. So what would the seller prefer to do? Would they rather put their home back on the market and try to get another buyer to pay the same price, close in our same time frame, or do they want to help us out with some of this, if that makes sense? So those are the types of things. Now, a big question that a lot of buyers agents have and a lot of buyers have is what happens after that 17 days? Big paragraph, big portion here, continuation of contingency. It says even after the end of time specified in 14b1 and before seller cancels, if at all, the buyer retains the right in writing to either remove the remaining contingencies or, what I've already highlighted, cancel this agreement based upon the remaining contingency. So, interesting way to think about it. The buyer has 17 days to do all their inspections and to make whatever request for repairs. And if they don't get what they want from that request of the repair, they should, or what it says in the contract, to remove the applicable contingency or cancel. However, even after the time specified in 14b1, 17 days, the buyer retains the right to cancel this agreement. What that means is that this is what's called an active contingency. That means that even after the end of time, you still have to formally remove it in writing in order for it to be removed. A passive contingency would mean on day 18, that ability is gone. So a lot of listing agents don't even really read this contract to know that the buyer retains the right to still cancel this agreement. So just know that in order to protect your buyer client, they still have, after this time frame, to cancel because they retain the right to. But again, we want to hold our end of the bargain up as best as we can, just to be shown that we're proceeding in good faith. But at least it's important to remember that we are protecting our client, and they are still protected after this time frame because of the way this is written, that this is now considered an active contingency in here. The seller does have an ability to cancel this agreement. There's only two ways that they can cancel this agreement. It says seller right to cancel because of buyer contingencies. If by the time specified in the agreement, the buyer does not deliver to a seller a removal of the applicable contingency or cancellation, then the seller, after delivery and notice of buyer to perform, may cancel this agreement. So let's just say it's 17 days, you don't remove it. The seller can formally request that you do it by sending you what's called a notice to buyer to perform, which again is an actual form that they have to supply you with. And after that, if you don't do the activity, they may cancel this agreement. That being said, in such an event, the seller shall authorize the return of buyer's deposit, except for fees incurred by the buyer. So even if you don't do what you say you're going to do, the seller says, hey, do what you say you're going to do in that form, and you don't, they cancel, the buyer still gets their deposit back per the contract. That's very important. Seller right to cancel based upon buyer contract obligations, aka you didn't say what you were going to do. You didn't do what you said you're going to do. Very common is the initial deposit. That's the most common thing that happens. The second most common thing is that they don't close escrow on the date that they're supposed to. Most of the time you're going to get notices to perform based upon contingencies or this one is really going to be the initial deposit and the closing of escrow, which is actually technically a different form, but that's a whole different topic in here. Same thing though, after delivering a notice to buyer to perform, they may cancel this agreement. But again, it says, in such an event, seller shall authorize the return of buyer's deposit, except for fees incurred by buyer, which is very minimal. They have to pre-sign saying that they understand that those are fees. Most of the time it's escrow fees or title fees, but most decent escrow and title companies do not charge those. So then what the heck is a notice to buyer to perform? A notice to buyer to perform is a formal form, and it has to be in writing, signed by the seller most of the time. But if it's a notice to seller to perform, it's by a buyer or a seller, and give the party at least 2 days after delivery to perform the action. So again, something to keep in mind is that it gives you 2 more days to do it, and it has to be in writing and signed by the seller in there. Now again, effective cancellation on deposits. Talking about who gets what and all of that. If buyer and seller gives written notice of cancellation pursuant to the rights duly exercised under the terms of the agreement, the parties agree to sign mutual instructions to cancel the sale and escrow and release deposits, if any, to the party entitled to the funds, less fees and costs incurred by that. If you're getting into a situation of cancellation, call me. I don't want to have this be a huge video, which it already is, but it's something to, this is a very big topic, but I want to at least inform you or make you aware of what this is. The next one is the final verification of property condition, aka the final walkthrough. This is really the last piece of the puzzle, usually done around the time of loan document signing. But what this is the buyer shall have the right to make a final verification of the property, aka walk through it one more time, within 5 days prior to the close of escrow. Very important. It's not a contingency of the sale, but solely to confirm that, number one, the property is maintained pursuant to paragraph 11, aka it's still in the same condition as before. The repairs have been completed as agreed. So let's just say you do your request for repair. Hey, I want you to fix A, B, and C, and they agree to that. This is the time that you go back in there and verify that they have repaired A, B, and C. And then we'll talk about the next paragraph talks about how you can do that, and that the seller has complied with seller's other obligations, making sure that they, take care of all the things that they have to take care of. Repairs. Repairs shall be completed. So if you do agree to repairs, they shall be completed prior to the final verification of condition, unless otherwise agreed to in writing. Those repairs to be performed at seller's expense may be performed by seller or through others, provided that the work complies with applicable law, including permits and all that stuff. So if you want a licensed and bonded plumber to fix a plumbing issue, make sure you put that in the request for repairs, saying X problem to be corrected by a licensed and bonded plumber. Because technically, as it's written in the contract, repairs can even be made by the seller, as long as the work complies with applicable law, with permitting and all that stuff that's required. So they shall be done in a good and skillful manner with materials of quality and appearance comparable to the existing thing. So again, they can't just Mickey Mouse it through. It has to be in a good, skillful manner, but the seller can do it themselves in there. But when you do the final walkthrough, the seller shall obtain invoices and paid receipts for repairs performed by the others, prepare a written statement indicating the repairs performed by the seller and the date of such repairs, and provide copies of invoices to the buyer at the final walkthrough. So that is something that is per the contract provided at that final walkthrough. So a lot of buyer clients may have a little bit of apprehension about the repairs because technically part of the request for repair says that the repairs are to be performed and the repair agreement is subject to the buyers removing their inspection contingency or their cancellation right under the condition. Some buyers feel concerned by saying, hey, I don't want to remove my contingency until I know that those repairs are done. Technically, that's not how it's written in the contract. However, they're protected by the fact that it is mandated on how those repairs are completed and what evidence is supplied to them as a buyer client. And they will get those when? During the final verification of the property condition, which is within 5 days prior to the close of escrow. There is a ton of other stuff that is in this contract, including the remedies for buyer breach of contract and liquidated damages. I'm not going to go into that right now. I have, again, a whole nother video based upon that, and they go into this in Power Curve as well. One of the things that I do want to highlight, because not a lot of people talk about it, is the definitions. Whenever you want to know what a day is or days after or whatever, it's written in here. It seems kind of simplistic, but trust me, when it comes down to contingency removal dates and dates of performance, this one becomes very important. That it lets you know what the definition of days after means. So that's pretty important there. Again, there's tons of this stuff that is involved in here. This is 10 pages of a legally binding contract. However, I wanted to at least introduce you to it. One of the things that was taught to me very early on, and it really helped me feel more comfortable with dealing with clientele, is that whenever a client, especially a buyer client, or any client, but I'm using this in the context of working with a buyer, whenever a buyer client asks you a question is, hey, when do I have to bring in the initial deposit? Hey, when do we have to do our final walkthrough? What was taught to me very early on was always speak in terms of the contract. Don't ever say, well, this is how it's usually done. It doesn't matter what you think. It doesn't matter of what has usually been done. It's what's in writing that prevails, and always speak in terms of the contract. So whenever possible, learn the paragraph numbers and the letters and all of that. That way you make the client feel more comfortable when you give them an answer. For example, when they ask you a question about the initial deposit, hey, when do I need to bring those in? You can very easily go to them and say, hey, per paragraph 3A in the contract, the initial deposit has to be brought in by electronic funds transfer within 3 business days after acceptance. Rather than saying, usually you try to bring it in as early as possible and it's usually done within 3 days. No, it's per the contract, and per paragraph 3A, it states that the buyer shall deliver the deposit directly into the escrow holder by electronic funds transfer within 3 business days after acceptance. Right? Same thing with, hey, when do we need to move our inspection contingency? Right? Well, per paragraph 14B1, you have 17 days after acceptance to remove that in writing. However, based upon the continuation of contingency clause, even after that time, you still retain the right to cancel this agreement. AKA, it's still written as you can, which means you're able to per the contract. So again, the more you know about this, the more you will have confidence, but also sometimes even more importantly, the buyer will have confidence in you. The more you can speak to the contract, the more dialogue or phrasing that you use that's congruent to the contract, the more professional you will sound, but also the less stress you'll put on yourself by having to quote unquote know what goes on in exactly what time frames. Read the contract. This is 10 pages, again, of a legally binding contract. Go over this. If you need to watch this video a number of times, do it. This is the most important document in the entirety of our business because the entire escrow is built on this. If you look at the very top, This is the California Residential Purchase Agreement and Joint Escrow Instructions. This is what instructs escrow on how the escrow is to be performed. So it doesn't matter what a client or an agent thinks is the right way to do it, or what they say is, well, the last time we did it, this is what happened. It's what's in this agreement is that what prevails. So if you have any questions, go back to the contract first, read it and say, what does the contract say? But if you have any other questions, you want help interpreting what it means, I'm always available. Again, this was an introduction to the contract. You will get a full fire hose of information at Power Curve, but I wanted to at least introduce you to it. I'm Jacob Lawler, and I'm committed to your success.